The Jansen Law Center, representing Illinois injury victims for over 40 years.
Welcome again to the Ask Jay Jansen show. We're going to go into a rather controversial topic today. It's a topic that involves a lot of emotions on both sides, and it's called medical malpractice. You know, we all want to love our doctors and our hospitals, but we know from statistics that the third leading cause of death in the United States is medical errors. So how do we deal with these cases? What's the byproduct of bringing these cases? Can we promote more safety so there are fewer cases? Let's take some questions from the audience. Let's hope that I can answer them and talk with this audience about cases that the Jansen Law Center has concluded with regard to medical malpractice. Do I have a question here? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hi, Jay. I had a question for you.
All right. Yeah. Tell me about it.
Medical injury cases regarding infections harder to pursue?
Right. Well, you know, all hospitals have an infection rate, and that rate is known to the Joint Commission that licenses hospitals throughout the United States. And the hospital tries to keep the infection rate as low as possible. But infections are a part of surgery. When you open the body, you expose that body to infections. That's why infection cases are very difficult to bring in court. Where did the microbes come from? You have Staphylococcus on your bathroom soap, but you know, if you don't have a break in your skin, you probably aren't going to get an infection. But people that are in the hospital that have had an operation are very vulnerable to infections, and that's one of the big problems in the United States. And it may not be malpractice. It may be just part of what we have to live with in today's world with regard to hospitals and cleanliness. Thank you. All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, Jay. What factors does an attorney consider to determine if there's a malpractice claim?
What do we have to consider if there's a malpractice case? In other words, what do we look at to determine whether there's a case? All right, every day our office receives calls from families, bereaved families many times, who have a loved one who died, or families who believe that the doctor or hospital did something wrong. And we listen to these questions over the phone. There's no charge ever to talk to the Jansen Law Center. We always have a number of attorneys on duty every day from 8:30 in the morning till 5 at night, 5 days a week. So we take the call and I'll question the people, and many times they start a roundabout talk about what happened. And I'll say, what do you think the doctor or hospital did wrong? And we'll do this in hundreds of cases. And many times, there really isn't anything the doctor or hospital did wrong. We probably answer 300 inquiries before we take one case. And then when I hear that one case where somebody tells me, for example, I think they gave my wife the wrong blood in the hospital. Now this happened. This happened some years ago. And I said, well, how do you know that? Well, a nurse came to me. My wife had an operation. The nurse came to me and said, I think you better go see Jay Jansen. Your wife got the wrong blood. And she had a reaction. Well, the woman did die. She died of disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is caused by a mixing of wrong blood. She was O positive and they gave her A positive in the operation. So how do we find all this out? We've got we've got a pretty good idea as to what went on. We get the hospital records. And under the Illinois Medical Records Act, the hospital has to provide the next of kin or their attorneys with all of the hospital records. There in the hospital records, we see the circulating nurse's signature. We see the fact that the A positive, O positive were both given to this woman during an operation. It killed her. So what do we do next? Well, you don't write a letter to a hospital and they don't write out a check in response because the hospital doesn't pay the claim. Hospitals have what they call malpractice insurance. The doctors have malpractice insurance. And if the doctor says, oh my goodness, I made an error, it's a terrible thing, that doesn't mean that his insurance company will agree to that because the insurance company is the one that's going to pay the money. So we take the deposition of the nurses, we take the deposition of the doctors, we have the medical records, we're ready to start trial on Monday morning against the hospital and the doctors because part of the surgical team was employed by the doctors, part of the surgical team was employed by the hospital. Well, after you go through 2-3 years of litigation, I've got a family, a bereaved family. Finally, the morning of trial, all of a sudden the 7-figure money shows up. That's a small part of the case. Doctors have peer review where they review errors. And these are confidential, by the way. I can't access that under the law. But they peer review something like this. How did this mistake take place? And that's why when you go into a hospital or even in the emergency room, they'll say, what's your name? What's your date of birth? What are you here for? And then 2 minutes later, somebody else comes in and asks you the same question because these errors do happen. And I think the byproduct of a case like I just told you, that unfortunate case of giving the woman the wrong 2 blood types that didn't match, the byproduct of that is safety. Do you think that hospital, again, is ever going to mix up the blood in the same refrigerator for that operating room? Never again, never again. So the byproduct is maybe we save a life or 2 with that case, and I was able to compensate the family. But byproduct of it is safety. Thank you very much.
Jay Jansen is one of the most preeminent and successful lawyers in the United States, building his practice on integrity, tenacity, and protecting the rights of innocent accident victims. Jay Jansen, one name really does say it all.
The Jansen Law Center, representing Illinois injury victims for over 40 years.
The most important factor in selecting a law firm is the historical success of that law firm. The insurance companies know the successful law firms. So should you.
Jay Jansen. One name says it all.
We're back with the Ask Jay Jansen show. Today's topic is medical negligence, which is medical malpractice. So we've got questions, and I'm going to try to answer these questions concerning hospital doctor negligence. Anybody have questions here? Yes, sir.
What does it take to prove that a doctor was negligent?
All right. There's certain standards in Illinois. It's statutory and it's also common law. Medical negligence is really a deviation from acceptable standards of care. In other words, if a doctor operates on the wrong leg, that's an obvious deviation from acceptable standards of care. If a doctor performs an operation that he's not licensed to perform, that again is a deviation. If you have damages, if you have somebody that is harmed by virtue of the operation. A case we concluded just recently involving a hospital and a doctor who was not licensed to perform the particular operation in question was a young man who was working at a Perkins restaurant in Illinois as a cook, and he had a hernia. Well, that's not really a serious matter, but he goes in for the operation on a hernia. He comes out of the hospital a month later, blind and paralyzed. What went wrong? We get boxes of records. We get the records from the hospital. We know something happened here. We go through with our doctors. We hire doctors and nurses to look at these records. We look at these records. It takes months to ferret out what went wrong, when it went wrong, and why it went wrong. That case was settled right before trial for $17.5 million. Now, the byproduct of that, because I don't want to sound like, okay, I'm taking these cases, it's just to collect money for the family. It isn't. The byproduct of that hospital never again will allow somebody to perform an operation that they were not qualified to do. And that poor man went from walking into the hospital with nothing more than a hernia to coming out of that hospital in a wheelchair, paralyzed and blind. So we've got to prohibit and stop that type of thing from happening. And I think the byproduct of these lawsuits against doctors and hospitals is safety. Anybody else having any questions? Yes, sir.
Jay, first of all, it's great to be here. I
Yeah.
was wondering if you could tell me if a hospital is liable when a doctor is negligent.
All right. See, many times the doctors are independent practitioners. They have an office. They use the hospital to operate, but they're an independent practitioner. And we call that doctor an independent contractor. Well, the hospitals say if the doctor makes an error, they're not responsible. But then we have another doctrine in Illinois called apparent agency. Because when you go into a hospital, you think the hospital stands behind the doctor. So there's some apparent agency. And then the hospitals provide many times the nurses, particularly in operations. And maybe the hospital even provides the anesthesiologist, who very well may be an independent contractor too. So we have apparent agency that sometimes allows us to jump over just the doctor and get the hospital also involved. Thank you very much. Good question. How about something else here? Let's talk some more. There, way in the back, okay?
If I want to get my medical records reviewed, how do I go about getting them from a doctor or a hospital?
The Illinois Medical Records Act has been on the books a long time. It allows the family of a decedent to obtain the medical records, and the spouse of a person can obtain the medical records. And of course, the patient, if the patient survives, you go to the medical records department of the hospital where you were in, you say, I want my medical records. Now, do they know what you want them for? Well, maybe they suspect a little bit, but you could be transferring your care to the Mayo Clinic. You could be going to Scripps Howard. You could be going someplace else. Well, how do you go to these other doctors for a second opinion or a third opinion? You have to have your medical records. So you're entitled to them. Most hospitals do not charge for these records. And you're absolutely entitled to those records under law. Thank you. How about another question here? Okay, yes, sir, come on up here. Oh, here.
Hi, Jay. More of a personal question for you. What is the most difficult medical malpractice trial you've ever dealt with, and what made it so tough?
Well, any of these cases that I try where I go into, say, another state, that's always difficult. Stay at a hotel, maybe I have another lawyer with me. Those are very difficult cases. But a case that I recall that we tried that involved both products liability and medical malpractice probably was one of the most difficult, and it was against Johnson & Johnson and Janssen Pharmaceutica. First of all, the doctor prescribed a medication that reacted with another medication. So the doctor was responsible to start with. But then we've got the drug company involved in it, not a hospital. But the thing that made the key to that case was the coroner. We had a good coroner in that area of the state of Illinois who did a pathological report on the decedent and said, this patient has 50 times, 100 times higher level of hismanol than they should have. Well, if I didn't have that, how could I make the case? Because almost, well, we see it all the time. What do the death certificates say generally? Cardiac arrest. Well, cardiac arrest is the result, but what caused the cardiac arrest? You see, you get the coroner usually, okay, cardiac arrest, and maybe they didn't even have an autopsy in a lot of cases. This particular case, they had an autopsy. We saw the high levels of hismanol. We knew it reacted with erythromycin. So you had both products liability, you had doctor liability, and we tried that case to a verdict against Johnson & Johnson and Janssen Pharmaceutical and won that case. Took us 4 or 5 years to do it, but we did it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. How about another question?
Have doctors ever admitted to you that they've committed malpractice?
The good ones do. You know why I say that? The good ones do. There's a lot of cover-up. You've all heard of the conspiracy of silence, where the doctors won't testify against other doctors. And it exists. When I try a case, I don't get a doctor from the locale of that doctor that's responsible or that hospital, because by and large, most all the doctors are insured by the same insurance company. And that doctor becomes a renegade if he comes out against his fellow doctors. But I've had several cases, and I had one with a wonderful surgeon who is outstanding in the state of Illinois. And a man bled to death after surgery. The doctor is supposed to follow that patient after surgery. He had nicked, what they call nicked an artery, and the patient bled to death, and that could have been repaired, and it was not followed closely. That doctor admitted the responsibility, and to this day, he's sorry. We're not perfect. Medicine isn't perfect. Lawyers aren't perfect. But the good doctors many times will come forward and say, I made an error. Now, that doesn't mean his insurance company is going to admit it, but once in a while you do see it. Thank you. I think we'll take a break now. Let's take a minute or two, and then we'll be back with more questions on medical malpractice, the Jay Jansen Show. Thank you.
Jansen Law Center, representing Illinois injury victims for over 40 years.
Deny, delay, don't pay. This is the motto of many, many insurance companies. You need an attorney that will stick with you through the end to bring your case to a successful conclusion. Consult the Jansen Law Center.
Jay Jansen. One name says it all.
Jay Jansen takes on big pharmaceutical, insurance, automotive, and Fortune 100 companies. Some cases have resulted in changes in the law and greater product safety. There is never a fee to discuss your case at the Jansen Law Center.
We're back with the Jay Jansen Show, and we've got questions from the audience tonight on medical malpractice. Any questions out here? Yes, ma'am. Come on up.
Hi, Jay. I have a question. Before surgery, you sign a consent form and it lists out things, complications that can happen. If one of the complications happens, does that mean you can't do anything about it?
I know these consent forms, they're drawn up by lawyers. You could lose your nose, you could lose your toes, you could lose, you lose your life. But those kind of forms do not exculpate things like giving the wrong blood or operating on the wrong leg or some of the medical negligence that we see that is a deviation from acceptable standards of care. So we get around those consent forms all the time. You didn't consent for a doctor to create an operation where he cut your aorta and you bled to death. You didn't consent to that, right?
Right.
Okay, good question. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am, come on.
I was wondering, how can you tell if a medical error case exists if the patient is dead?
All right. Many times families call us and their loved one has passed on, and then we see these death certificates. We start with the death certificate many times. We think that, well, the death certificate will tell us something. But the death certificate so many times just says cardiac arrest. Well, cardiac arrest, why? What caused the cardiac arrest? You've got to go back many steps. So then we get the medical records under the Illinois Medical Records Act. We scan those records, we look at them, we have our doctors examine those records, nurses examine those records, plus our attorneys who can almost feel when there's a malpractice. You know the result. What happened bad here? Something happened bad. That patient went into the hospital in good spirits, good health, and all of a sudden they're dead. All right, what happened? So then we scour these records. Our doctors say, these records don't tell the whole story. There's some things missing here. So what happened? And then we start piecing it together, and it's like detective work. And you can make a case many times that way. But you've got to start with the medical records. We examine medical records free of charge. If we take the case, we charge a contingent fee, and it's generally a 1/3 contingent fee. If we don't win the case, you don't pay the lawyer. So I only want to take cases I'm winning, right? And it gives the public a door to the courthouse, gives you the keys to the courthouse, because you're not going to spend $100,000, $200,000 on a case fighting a doctor in a hospital. The lawyer advances that money. And, sometimes at the end of the year, I ask our financial people, how many cases did we take that we didn't make a recovery on? And once in a while, they tell me, we recovered on every one. But then again, we get first choice. We don't take a case unless we think that there was a wrong that we can right and we can compensate the family. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next question. Anybody else? Yes. Yes, ma'am.
So you said that medical negligence was the third leading cause of death in the U.S., but there are very few of these cases filed in court. So why is that?
All right. Number one, there's medical negligence. There's hospital negligence. Many times the family accepts it as God's will. A lot of people, oh, it's a shame. We don't want to, we're not the kind of people that sue. I hear that all the time. Well, you're not the kind of people that sue until it happens to you, And I think that most of these cases are never brought to attorneys. And very frankly, there aren't many attorneys that will take medical malpractice cases because they take a long period of time and they take a lot of money and a lot of work. But the byproduct is safety for all of us. So I don't think peer review works with doctors. They're after an error and there's a death and they know that something went wrong at the hospital and the doctors and the nurses meet and they have peer review. It's not public. Nobody knows about it. And that case may never, ever reach a public hearing or go to a lawyer. For example, families have children born, and it's very common the family says, oh, it's a cerebral palsy case. Well, the child is paralyzed, the child may be blind, the child may be in a wheelchair the rest of that child's life. What went wrong? It isn't all genetics. You've got to get the medical records. You find out that the doctor's at a cocktail party. The nurses have been trying to reach him. The fetal monitor strips are you've got fetal distress all over the place. Nobody's there. The child's finally born and the child has hypoxia. That child, the rest of his life, or her life, is going to be a paralyzed child. We go back like detectives and find out what went wrong. We'll go to the neighbors of the doctor. Where was the doctor that night? You find out some things that you just couldn't believe. But these, many times the cerebral palsy children, disadvantaged children, it's genes, it's just part of life. But many, many times, and we've had it many, many times, we've handled these cases. They're medical negligence cases where that mother went into fetal distress. Fetal monitoring showed it. There should have been a cesarean section. There wasn't a doctor around. And that child was born deformed. So it tears your heart out to take these cases. But it makes me feel good when I'm finished with the case. Money is a small compensation to give a family like that. But maybe it saves somebody else from having that kind of problem. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks for taking my question. I was wondering, why does it take so long for medical malpractice suits to come to completion?
Well, first of all, very few medical malpractice suits are settled. The hospitals and the doctors don't really control the litigation. The insurance company for the hospital and the insurance company for the doctors control the litigation. They have found nationwide, if they deny cases and string them out, that very few attorneys will take these cases because of the expense. And then, frankly, nationwide, less than 1/2 of the cases that are taken and are brought to trial on medical malpractice are won. So a lot of cases are lost. The doctor comes in, testifies, that's the best I could do, I tried so hard, and jurors are prone to have faith in their doctor, But about half of these cases, or a little over half, that actually go to trial are lost. So how many lawyers are willing to take these cases if you're going to end up putting out over $100,000? I don't get my witnesses from the locale where I take the case. I get my witnesses from California, New York, Phoenix. I get doctors who are at the top level that can't be questioned that come in and testify. What do these doctors charge? $25,000 a day. Then I keep them over at the hotel to come in for rebuttal. That's another $25,000. Well, you got to hope you're going to win those cases. The lawyer you hire today can make a big difference in your life tomorrow.
One name says it all.
This was a wonderful session with a wonderful audience, inquisitive and asking questions on medical malpractice, medical negligence. We'll do another show another time. Thank you for watching The Jay Jansen Show. Thank you.
Jay Jansen. One name says it all.